You who are watching right now, pause for a moment and click the like button and subscribe to the channel because I am absolutely confident that you will enjoy the content and be captivated from beginning to end. Now, take a deep breath, put on your headphones, sit back, relax, and let me take you on a quiet journey full of excitement and tranquility. Together, in the depths of the vast desert on the banks of the Nile, arose one of the greatest civilizations known to history, the Pharaohs, the Egyptians. Masters of their time and rulers of the Holy Land, they built massive temples and raised pyramids that became wonders of the world. They wrote their names in stone as if they wanted to immortalize themselves against the passage of time. But no matter how great a human becomes, they remain susceptible to fall. The story of the Pharaohs is not just a tale of glory, but also a tale of demise. With each new king, a light would shine, then slowly fade. History tells us that ancient Egypt did not fall suddenly. Its fall was not like a flash of lightning, but rather like a sun setting slowly. For thousands of years, the features of weakness began to creep, bit by bit, into this massive entity. It began with the division of power, the disputes of heirs over the throne, and the weakening of the central grip on the regions. In the Nile Valley, where life once flourished, the seeds of competition appeared, and Egypt began to know internal chaos. For the first time, the name Pharaoh was no longer enough to unite the people. The image of the sacred king, viewed as a son of God, was broken, and he became merely a human who could weaken and be defeated. This is the long story we will narrate together, how the Pharaohs fell, and how the greatest civilization known to the ancient world ended. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes. And listen quietly. For the story is not told in haste, but recounted leisurely, like the flow of the Nile River. After the first eras of glory, after the pyramids rose as a witness to the strength of the Old Kingdom, Egypt began to enter a new phase, less splendid and more turbulent, which historians call the First Intermediate Period. This was after the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BC. Then, weakness began to creep onto the throne of the Pharaohs. The king, who was considered a living god on earth, became just a ruler besieged by problems. Economic crises accumulated. The Nile flood decreased in successive years, leading to crop shortages and the spread of famine among the people. Because the ancient Egyptian depended on the Nile for everything, any disruption in its waters meant a real catastrophe. Amid hunger and suffering, the pharaoh's authority weakened. The local governors of the regions, known as nomarchs, began controlling their lands as if they were minor kings. The pharaoh was no longer able to impose his prestige upon them. Each region now had its own small army and independent economy. Over time, Egypt was no longer a single unified state, but a collection of small, conflicting kingdoms. In the south, in the city of Thebes, strong leaders emerged who wanted to reunify the country. And in the north, in the Delta region, there were also those who competed with them for the throne. Egypt became an arena for long conflicts between those aspiring to rule. But despite the chaos, the flame of civilization did not go out. Art continued, writing continued, and the people carried on with their lives on the banks of the Nile. As if Egypt was saying, even in my weakest moments, I remain present. This situation continued for more than a century, a full century of division, weakness, hunger, and conflict, until the kings of Thebes came and slowly managed to restore unity, so Egypt rose again and entered the Middle Kingdom. But this resurgence was only a short respite in the long journey of decline, for time always carries new ordeals within its folds. After a full century of decay and division, Egypt regained its breath. From the city of Thebes in the south, new, strong, and determined kings emerged. They were the kings of the Middle Kingdom who rebuilt what had been destroyed and restored unity to the land of the Nile. Egypt began to breathe again. Canals were dug, fields were planted, and life returned to villages and cities. Temples were reopened, and religious hymns were chanted again. It was as if the Egyptians wanted to forget the years of chaos and hunger. But despite this renaissance, something was different. The pharaohs of this era no longer possessed the aura of absolute sanctity as their ancestors had. People had learned that a pharaoh could fall and could fail to protect them. Therefore, we see in the literature of the Middle Kingdom sad texts full of wisdom and contemplation, texts that speak of the changing times and the chaos the country lived through. The ancient Egyptian had become more aware of the fragility of the world. Nevertheless, Egypt remained strong for a period. The kings of the Middle Kingdom waged wars against tribes in the south and against invaders from the east, always trying to protect their borders and secure trade routes. But over time, problems began to return. The later kings were weaker than the founding founders, and the central authority began to crack again. As soon as the end of the 12th dynasty arrived, Egypt entered once more into a whirlpool of decay, beginning what historians call the Second Intermediate Period. This time, the division was not only internal, danger came from abroad, from the east, through the gate of the Delta. New people entered, known to the Egyptians as the Hyksos. And Egypt was preparing for a harsh test, the likes of which it had not known since the rise of its civilization. The Nile flowed peacefully. The fields were still green. But Egypt, internally, was fragile and cracked. Weak. And in a moment of such weakness, strange winds from the east crept in. Nomadic, fighting groups came, strong and advanced in the arts of war. They possessed horses and chariots, technologies the Egyptians had not known before. These were the Hyksos. They entered the Nile Valley gradually, first as traders and immigrants, then as warriors and invaders. With the laxity of the Pharaoh's authority in the north, they managed to impose their control over everything. After years of infiltration, they sat on the throne of Egypt and took the titles of the pharaohs themselves. It was a shocking scene. For the first time in Egypt's long history, it was ruled by foreigners. The prestige of the pharaoh was broken, and Egypt became subject to a foreign power. But this was not a total occupation. The Hyksos controlled the north, while the south, especially the city of Thebes, remained in the hands of the native Egyptians. And from there, the resistance began. In Thebes, royal families inherited the burden of reclaiming the country. They knew that Egypt could not live divided between strangers and its own children. They waged long and fierce battles. Texts recount that King Seqenenretau led a revolt against the Hyksos but died in battle. His mummified body still bears the marks of blows on his skull. Then came his son, Kamose, who continued the fight. Finally, victory came at the hands of the young king Ahmose I. He expelled the Hyksos and unified Egypt once again, founding a new era known as the New Kingdom, with which Egypt entered its final golden age. The age of power and conquests. The age of military glory. The age of great kings like Thutmose III and Ramses II. But even in this golden age, the seeds of fall were slowly taking root. For what rises must fall, and what flourishes must wither one day. After the Hyksos were expelled from the land of Egypt, the Egyptians were never the same again. They realized that their country was not forever fortified and that danger could come from any gate, east or west. Thus, Egypt transformed into a major military power. It was no longer content with defending itself but began expanding its influence beyond its borders. Egyptian armies advanced north towards the Levant and south towards Nubia, until Egypt became a far-flung empire. In the era of the great kings, Egypt reached the peak of its glory. It waged more than 17 successful military campaigns and subdued the surrounding kingdoms. Thutmose III was sometimes called the Napoleon of the ancient Near East. Then came the reign of the famous Queen Hatshepsut, who entered history not only as a woman who sat on the throne but because she led Egypt in an era of tremendous commercial prosperity. Her naval expeditions to the land of Punt brought Egypt gold, incense, and ivory, making its economy more prosperous than ever before. After her, Ramses II shone, considered one of the greatest kings of Egypt of all time. It was he who fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites and left us great monuments like the temples of Abu Simbel. In his reign, Egypt reached the height of its military and architectural greatness. But amidst this glory, there were small cracks slowly widening. Imperial expansion exhausted the country. The constant wars drained the armies and resources. The multitude of huge temples and palaces consumed the state's treasuries. Then a different pharaoh appeared, Akhenaten. That king who tried to change the entire religion of Egypt and call for the worship of a single god named Aten. His religious revolution caused internal conflicts and destabilized the country. After his death, everything quickly returned to what it was, but the wounds of division remained. Over time, the prestige of the pharaohs began to diminish. They were no longer the living gods whom everyone feared, they became rulers fighting over power. And the people were growing poorer, while the nobles and priests were increasing in strength and influence. The new kingdom was the pinnacle of Egypt, but it was also the last rising sun before sunset. And after it would begin the long era of decline. When Ramses II died, he left behind a huge legacy of temples, statues, and heroic stories. But behind the curtain, Egypt had begun to lose its balance. The long wars with the Hittites and the battles to defend the eastern borders had exhausted the state's treasuries. Those who came after Ramses had to face a difficult reality: fewer resources, increasingly rebellious peoples, and priests whose influence grew day by day. The priests, especially the priests of Ammonius in Thebes, became a force parallel to the pharaoh's authority. They owned wealth and controlled the temples, which were like the heart of the economy and religion. With the weakening of the kings, the priests gradually imposed their control. In contrast, the Egyptian armies were no longer as strong as before. The great expansion of the empire shrank, and the vassal states began to become independent one after another. The Levant was no longer obedient, and Nubia in the south always needed campaigns to subdue it. The ordinary Egyptians, who were the mainstay of civilization, began to suffer from poverty and heavy taxes, while royal palaces were still being built and temples were adorned with gold. This clear contradiction planted seeds of weakness from within. Then came the reign of Ramses III, the last of the strong kings of the 20th dynasty. He faced what are known as the Sea Peoples, mysterious groups who came from the Mediterranean Sea and tried to invade Egypt. Although Ramses III defeated them in famous battles, the victory came at a high price. It drained the country's resources even more, and Egypt entered afterwards into a spiral of deterioration. Weak kings succeeded one another. Names repeated without glory. With each generation, the pharaoh's authority diminished, and the priest's power swelled, until rule became akin to sharing between the throne and the priesthood, instead of a single pharaoh ruling everyone. And thus, Egypt entered what is known as the Third Intermediate Period, an era that spanned centuries, filled with divisions, invasions, and foreign interventions. The Nile still flowed, but Egypt was no longer as it was. After the death of Ramses III, Egypt entered a long tunnel of weakness and division. The central authority gradually crumbled until the pharaoh no longer ruled the country with his grip as in the past. In Thebes, the priests controlled the temples and wealth until they became the de facto rulers of the south. In the Nile Delta, weak kings tried to hold on to the throne, but without prestige or power. And so, the country was divided between two authorities, the authority of the priests and the authority of the king. In this era, the pharaoh was no longer a sacred god in the eyes of the people, he became one of several parties competing for influence. And Egypt's image in the eyes of its neighbors was declining after it had been the mistress of the East. But the decay did not come only from within. The eyes of foreign powers began to turn towards the Nile Valley. Libyans infiltrated through the western borders and settled in Egypt until they became significant. After a period, they even reached the rule itself, and some of them were crowned kings of the country. Egyptian blood no longer solely occupied the throne. Egypt's features began to change, and it became a mixture of its original children and incoming peoples. Despite all this, the Egyptians retained their ancient civilization. Art did not die out, and temples did not stop being built, but political and military power was no longer what it was. Egypt became like a wise old man with a great history but no longer able to walk with steady steps as in his youth. And time did not stop there. After the Libyans, it was the turn of the Nubians from the south. They controlled Egypt for a period and established what is known as the Kushite dynasty. Egypt had become an open theater for the rising powers around it. And thus, the ancient Egyptian identity began to crack, and the pharaoh became merely a title that could be held by an Egyptian, a Libyan, or a Nubian, but always under the shadow of the great Egyptian civilization. However, the winds from the east carried a greater danger. A new rising power known as the Assyrians would have a profound effect in shaking what remained of the pharaoh's prestige. With the weakening of the kings and the disputes of the priests, Egypt became easy prey for the ambitions of the great powers of that time. A merciless force appeared on the scene, a force accustomed to invasion and control, the Assyrians. In the 7th century BC, the Assyrians advanced towards the Nile Valley. Their armies were among the strongest in the ancient world, trained, organized, and armed with iron. They entered the delta and defeated the Egyptians, even occupying the city of Thebes itself and burning it. This was a shock to the Egyptians, their holy capital was being violated by invaders. But Assyrian rule did not last long. They withdrew after years, leaving behind deep wounds and an Egypt weaker than before. After a short period, a new, stronger, and more organized player appeared on the stage, the Achaemenid Persians. In the 6th century BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great founded a huge empire that stretched from India to the shores of the Mediterranean. It was natural that his gaze would turn to Egypt, that country rich in wheat and gold. During the reign of his son, Cambyses II, the Persian armies moved through Sinai and entered Egypt in 525 BC. The Egyptians lost their decisive battle at Pelusium, where accounts say the Persians used animals like cats to hide behind, knowing their sacred status to the Egyptians. After that defeat, the Persians entered Memphis, the capital, and Cambyses declared himself pharaoh of Egypt. From that day on, Egypt was no longer its own master. It had become a Persian province, ruled by a Persian satrap in the name of the emperor. This was a critical turning point in the history of the pharaohs. The throne that carried names like Ramses and Thutmose was now ruled by the command of a foreign man who spoke another language and worshipped other gods. Although the Egyptians revolted from time to time and tried to regain their independence, their grip on their destiny was no longer strong. Egypt had begun to enter an era of dependence on foreigners, an era that would last a long time and repeat with new powers every century or two. But the story of the fall was not over yet. After the Persians, a great man would appear from the west, coming from Macedonia. He would change the face of all history, Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BC, Egypt was exhausted by wars, invasions, and heavy Persian taxes. The people were grumbling, the priests were conspiring, and the pharaoh was no more than a shadow without sovereignty. In that atmosphere, a new star appeared on the horizon, a young Macedonian named Alexander the Great. He led invincible armies and succeeded toppling the entire Persian Empire in a few short years. When Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BC, he faced little resistance. On the contrary, the Egyptians welcomed him as a savior from Persian oppression. He went to the temple of Ammonius in the Siwa oasis, where the priests declared him a son of the god, as if he were a new pharaoh. But Alexander's rule did not last long, he died young. After his death, Egypt fell into the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy I, founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. From that time on, the rulers of Egypt were foreigners who spoke Greek and lived by different customs, but they took the title of pharaoh. The era of the true pharaohs had ended. The thousands of years of pure Egyptian civilization were over, replaced by a long foreign rule, the Greeks, then the Romans, then others through the centuries. The story of the fall of the pharaohs was not a sudden collapse, but a long journey full of internal divisions, repeated decay, and foreign invasions. From the greatness of the pyramids in the Old Kingdom to the collapse in the intermediate periods, from the glory of the New Kingdom, Thutmose and Ramses, to the weakness of the kings and the domination of the priests, from the invasion of the Hyksos to the Persian occupation, then to the entry of Alexander. Pharaonic Egypt fell. But its civilization did not die. The temples still stand tall. The papyri still speak with wisdom. The pyramids stand as an eternal witness that glory, however it may fade, leaves its mark alive. It is the story of Egypt, which taught the world the meaning of civilization. Then it also taught it that every civilization, no matter how great it becomes, carries within it the moment of its fall. And now, as night has drawn its curtain, the echo of history remains, whispering in the ear. Everything that flourishes then withers. And every civilization has its dawn and its sunset.